Hey everybody, this is Charlie Weingroff for SportsRehabExpertPodcast.com. And this week, the question or questions that have been asked for me to talk about were, why do I think the cervical spine is such an important part of what we define the core as? And also try to discuss a little bit why I think that the giraffe demonstrates what I think the strong core is. Last week, I mentioned a little bit about how I would define the example of the giraffe in a static position of managing an incredibly long spine, and that to me, in essence, is what a strong core is. So I'll start first with some abstract opinion, which maybe one day will be where, if the cards ever come through, that will be my PhD topics. But what I want to consider is when you look at quadruped animals and we see a few things that we really should start to, some things that we may already be doing, but some things that we really should start to consider in when we look to train for spinal stability. First and foremost, we already do utilize the quadruped pattern that these animals typically have. And there's tremendous advantage of quadruped. We certainly limit compressive forces, but most importantly, the visceral drop, if that's an official term, but our innards pulling down on the spine create a natural reaction for stability, particularly of the lumbar spine, in how we as humans engage quadruped position. So we've already learned quite a bit from these quadrupeds, such as a giraffe, in how to train the core. Quadruped is certainly incredibly valuable for training rotary stability with bird dogs, quadruped diagonals, and the like. But another thing to consider when we look at these quadrupeds is that even though they do have changes in curves throughout their entire spine, I don't think, this is certainly my opinion, but again, one day something I may study in far more depth. I do not see the delineation of the four curves that we have in the human spine. We don't see radical changes in convex and concave through cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral areas. They're there, but I don't think they're as defined. And I think that's probably an evolutionary effect. A lot of times that you've heard me speak about evolutionary changes, these are very, very anecdotal and opinion-based. But because quadrupeds don't have a need to deal with compressive loads, unless, of course, they're running into a wall, their spines are not adapted for that. But we also know that quadruped is an incredibly stable position for the spine, so how can we take those bits of information? We already got the quadruped down, but we have to continue to bring that we have to continue to take those positions and put them into more appropriate positions of function. So from there, we have to try to assimilate this long spine that we see the giraffe and these quadrupeds being able to control. And just like when we look for a posterior pelvic tilt in the pelvis, to me a posterior pelvic tilt or a posterior tilt in the cervical spine is pulling the neck backwards. We're looking for that retrusion position that our friends that are trained in McKenzie would be well aware of. We're looking to flatten out that cervical lordosis the same way a posterior pelvic tilt would flatten out the lumbar lordosis. We're trying to create the flatter or more one piece of a spine that we see in the quadrupeds. Now, that is not the position that we would ultimately function in, but it is a position that we'll train in because, again, just like the lumbar spine, I believe the cervical spine is not becoming a kyphotic spine. It's not becoming it's not becoming something inappropriate. We're just bringing it back to where it probably belongs. And because of the propensity that a human would have to hang in an anterior pelvic tilt, we do the same thing with our forward head posture. We then decrease joint space in the cervical spine. We hang and we create what's a hyperlordosis. So when you pull the chin back and create laser beam eyes, so your your head, your upper cervical spine is having no rotation. There is nothing at the high cervical. We just retrude the middle cervical spine, the same cervical spine that we see all of our disc problems in. You don't typically see C3 and C4 discs. You see C5, you see C6, C7, etc. as they radiate down our arms. But what we're really trying to accomplish is create a spine devoid of curves. Obviously, we need to have that happen at the pelvis. We also need to have that happen at the neck. As a result of that improving mechanoreception through the cervical spine, we then have a reciprocal inhibition of the sternocleidomastoid, of the scalenes. We have an allowance for our deep cervical flexors to activate, and then as I go from some abstract opinion, we then get into science-based and evidence-based, where we know that the deep neck flexors are a major player in the inner core. If the diaphragm is the parachute, and when you look at parachutes and they have that little parachute up above the main parachute, I'll call those the deep neck flexors. The strings that hold the person are the multifidus and the transverse abdominis, and the weight of the human attached to the parachute is the pelvic floor. We need all of these in concert to have elite intra-abdominal pressure, which is where we will go in part of our definition for a strong core. So certainly we would start with the cervical spine having elite mobility. In the upper cervical suboccipitals, we need to decrease local tone and or trigger points through the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes. And from there, we would teach this posterior tilt of the neck, packing the neck, retrusion of the cervical spine, in an effort to then activate deep neck flexors through breathing and through all of our exercises. So there's where the neck has a tremendous implication, where don't necessarily look at it as a neck. Don't necessarily look at it as a cervical spine. Let's look at the spine from the cranium, from the tip, all the way down to our butt, through our end of our coccyx, and look at it as one long spine, because I think that's what we see in quadruped animals. And then certainly from a very lay way, I'd welcome anybody to do that position with their neck and try to get a deep diaphragmatic breath, and then give yourself an exaggerated forward head posture and try the same breath. I think many folks would probably find that the breath is a little bit more labored or difficult to get as much intra-abdominal pressure. Pull the neck back, we'll get more intra-abdominal pressure, which will then give us more spinal stability, which will then give us a little bit more juice to wheel our arms and legs around. So I hope that is clear in explaining at least why, number one, we think the cervical spine is a tremendous player in spinal stability, and also how the giraffe, which would have the longest spine on Earth as far as